So part of your focus is exposing false beliefs about renewable energy and the problems with the ESG narrative, which I love to hear. Could you break down some of the more persistent myths that come up and that you're trying to expel when it comes to renewable energy?
Sure. I mean, I think one of the more pernicious myths is that solar and wind power is cheaper than other traditional energy sources. I mean, this is absolutely false if you take a full cost accounting view. When you think about wind and solar power, they're in essence expensive, wasteful add-ons to the existing energy grid. Because of their intermittency, I mean, obviously the sun's not shining all the time, the wind's not blowing all the time. And when you look at a grid like Texas or California, where they're having significant issues with blackouts and not being able to generate enough energy during peak demand, what you're seeing is you need a redundant grid. You basically, for every megawatt of solar and wind that you have on the grid, you really need a megawatt of usually natural gas or some type of traditional energy source. Because what happens when those go to zero, which we saw in Texas? You know, during the height of the energy emergency this summer in Texas, when everyone was cranking their air conditioners and there was so much demand for electricity, wind power was like less than 3% of installed capacity. Right? So how in the world are you supposed to run civilization when you have fickle energy sources that whether they decide to show up to work or not? You can't run civilization like that. So that Texas example is a perfect reason why we cannot count on these resources. And if you can't count on them, then that means you have to have that redundancy, and that means you have all of the investment in that natural gas plant, in the pipelines, and basically maintaining that whole system. And in addition to that, because of a lot of the voltage issues, basically wind and solar power are injecting chaos into the system, right? Because they're going up and down. As clouds come over, you get a solar slam, basically wind droughts. So you're introducing this chaotic force into the energy system that's more expensive to manage. Now you have many different decentralized generation assets that are much more complex to manage and balance the grid. The grid has to be balanced 100% of the time, right? You can't have a deficiency. So that's one core reason why wind and solar are not cheaper. Thinking that they're cheaper just because at a particular hour during the day when the sun's out that the cost of energy is cheaper is crazy. You're only looking at a teeny part of the equation and ignoring all of the other costs that are real costs. And this is why in every place in the world where there's a high penetration of renewable energy, or there's a mandate, so across the United States, there's a number of states that have what's called renewable portfolio standards, meaning there's some kind of mandate to get to 20% or 30% or more renewable power. You see increased utility costs to consumers, because even if the wholesale cost is lower for a few hours during the day, ultimately all these additional costs are getting passed on to the consumer. Utilities aren't charities. They're not going to just eat all of these additional costs. And I think the best example of this is Germany, because there is no country on face of planet Earth that has invested more in renewables. Over the last 20 years, they call it their energy transition plan. It's called the Energiewende. And they have spent about close to €500 billion over these 2 decades. And they still had to maintain 90% of their fossil fuel generation fleet. Their utility costs have doubled during this time, and now you're seeing the deindustrialization of Germany, because none of these businesses can afford, if you're a ceramics factory, glass factory, and aluminum smelter, steel smelter, these are energy intensive industries that can't afford to operate. So they're either rationing or shutting down and considering moving out of Europe. So for all those reasons, energy costs are higher with solar and wind power.
Tens of thousands of protesters in Germany took to the streets in response to the energy crisis and a new government package that many call an unfair distribution of funds. To combat rising energy and living prices, Germany's parliament on Friday approved a $195 billion rescue package that covers a one-time monthly gas bill for households and small and medium-sized businesses, as well as a cap on electricity prices. Driven by higher energy costs, German inflation in September hit its highest level in more than a quarter of a century. Protester Annette Gernert-Gier joined the march in Dusseldorf.
I think that with all these people who now worry, barely making it through the day, barely making it through the night, we need to intervene immediately. And the government has already found many ways to help, but it is still too scattered. That is a pity.
How in the world are you supposed to run civilization when you have fickle energy sources that whether they decide to show up to work or not? You can't run civilization like that.